My name is Isobel Crane. I am 26 years old. And the word my family used most often in the week after I moved out was selfish, which is interesting, given that for 31 consecutive months, I had been the reason they had a roof over their heads. I want to say that plainly, without drama, because it is a plain and undramatic fact. Not metaphorical. Not exaggerated for effect. Every month from September 2021 to March 2024, a transfer of $1,850 left my account and became my family's rent. My mother, my younger brother Declan, my Aunt Rosalind, who moved in with them in 2022 when her own situation became difficult. 3 adults in a 3-bedroom apartment in a city where rents had climbed steadily for 4 years, and the only reason the landlord had not moved to evict them was because a payment arrived reliably on the 2nd of every month from an account registered in my name. I was 23 when I started. I was 26 when I stopped. And in between, not one of them ever asked directly who was making the payment, which is the detail I have had to sit with the longest. Not the ingratitude, not the names I was called, but the specific quality of a silence that knows and chooses not to look. The week I moved out was the last week of March 2024. I had been planning it quietly since January, had found the apartment in early February, had signed the lease on February 19th at 4:30 p.m. in the office of a property manager named Gerald Osei, had paid the first month and deposit out of savings I had been accumulating in a separate account that I did not mention to my family because mentioning it would have required explaining why I needed a separate account, and explaining that would have started a conversation I was not ready to have. I told my mother on a Sunday evening, March 17th, at 7:48 p.m. I had driven over to the apartment where she lived with Declan and Rosalind, made tea, sat at the kitchen table where I had sat for most of my adult life, and said, "I have signed a lease. I am moving out on the 29th. I wanted to tell you in person." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "You're leaving?" I said yes. I said I had found a place I liked, and I was ready to have my own space. She did not say congratulations. She did not ask about the apartment. She said, "I hope you know what this does to this family." And she got up from the table and went to her bedroom and closed the door quietly, which is the way she registers the most serious disapproval, not a slam, a close. Deliberate. Measured. Declan was in the living room. He had heard. He shrugged at me from the couch and said, "She'll come around." He did not ask about the lease either. Rosalind called the next morning at 8:14 a.m., which told me my mother had called her that night. She said she was concerned, that the family had been through a lot and now was not a good time for changes, that she hoped I had thought this through. I said I had. She said she hoped I knew that family was not something you could just walk away from when it got inconvenient. I said I was moving into a different apartment, not a different country. She said, "That's very easy for you to say." I thanked her for calling. I hung up. I sat in my car for 11 minutes in the parking lot of the building where I worked, engine off, looking at the steering wheel. That was March 18th. The moving date was March 29th. The rent transfer, the $1,850, was set to come out on the 2nd of April. I had not yet decided what to do about it. Before I tell you what I decided about that rent transfer, I want to ask you something. Wherever you are right now, whatever city, whatever season, is it the kind of place where you feel like you belong, or the kind where you've always felt slightly like a guest who stayed too long? I ask because belonging is what the story is really about, underneath the money and the voice notes and the 4 minutes of disappointment for my uncle. I spent 26 years trying to belong to a family that I was also, in a quiet and unacknowledged way, keeping alive financially. And I want you to understand how those two things coexisted before I tell you how they stopped. I grew up in the apartment. My mother, Vera, had rented it since I was 7. The same unit, the same landlord, the same view of the parking structure from the kitchen window. My father left when I was 9, and the financial situation of the household was, for most of my childhood and adolescence, something that existed in the background like weather. Always present, never quite stable. Not discussed in terms a child could act on. What I understood, growing up, was that money was tight and that the correct response to money being tight was to not require much. I did not ask for things. I worked my first part-time job at 16 at a bakery 2 bus stops from the apartment, and gave my mother $200 of my first paycheck because she mentioned at dinner one night that the electric bill had come in high. She took it without making it a moment. That was how our family handled the transfer of financial responsibility. Not as a gift, not as a burden, just as a fact that got absorbed and moved on from. By the time I was 20 and had graduated from a 2-year design program and found steady work at a small branding studio, I was covering the utilities, electricity, internet, the streaming subscriptions my brother and aunt used without anyone formally asking me to. It had happened the way everything financial in that household happened. Incrementally, without conversation, through the logic of who had money and who needed it and who was capable of not making it awkward. In the summer of 2021, the situation changed. The landlord, a property management company that had bought the building 2 years earlier, sent a notice of rent increase effective September 1st. The new rate was $1,850 a month, up from $1,640. My mother showed me the letter on a Saturday morning in July, sitting at the kitchen table, and the way she held it told me she had already decided what it meant. She said, "I don't know how we manage this." Declan was 20 at the time and working intermittent hours at a warehouse. Rosalind had not yet moved in. My mother's income from her administrative job covered the existing rent with very little margin. The increase of $210 a month was, in the economy of their household, significant. I told her I would cover the difference. She said, "Are you sure?" I said yes. She said thank you and squeezed my hand across the table, and we did not discuss it again. What I did not say, because the words for it did not come until much later, was that I intended to cover the whole rent, not just the increase. The reasoning at the time was practical. If I was going to set up a transfer anyway, it was simpler to handle the full amount and have my mother's income go toward groceries and her own incidentals, rather than coordinating a split each month that would require both of us to be organized about money in a way our family had never been. So I set up a standing transfer. $1,850 on the 2nd of each month, directly to the property management company's account. I had the reference number. I had the confirmation. I kept the email receipts in a folder on my computer labeled with the year and rent. My mother knew I was covering the difference. She did not know I was covering all of it. I did not correct this impression for 31 months, which is a form of silence I have thought about carefully and which I do not entirely excuse in myself, but which I understand. If I told her I was paying the full rent, she would have felt she needed to say something about it. And the something she would have said might have included resistance or obligation or a renegotiation of the dynamic that would have made the whole arrangement more complicated than it needed to be. I needed it to be simple. So I kept it simple, which meant I kept it quiet. In January 2022, Rosalind moved in. Her own rental situation had collapsed, a landlord dispute that turned into an eviction she contested unsuccessfully, and she arrived with 3 suitcases and a level of disruption to the household's equilibrium that nobody named directly. She was my mother's sister. It was not a question of whether she could stay. The question was simply how long, and the answer to that question expanded gradually from weeks to months to what eventually became permanent. Rosalind's presence did not change the rent amount. The lease was my mother's and the $1,850 stayed fixed, but it changed the household's financial texture in ways I observed without commenting on. Rosalind was not working steadily. She contributed to groceries sporadically. She used the streaming services and the Wi-Fi and the utilities I was covering, and she did so with the comfortable unawareness of someone who has been told, implicitly, that the infrastructure is taken care of. She was not unkind to me. She was warm in the way some people are warm when they do not need anything from you in a particular moment. I did not resent her presence. I resented the assumption that undergirded it, that the apartment and everything in it was simply available because it was simply provided, and the question of by whom did not require investigation. By mid-2023, I had been at the branding studio for 3 years and had taken on 2 independent clients on the side, and my income had grown to a point where covering the rent was not the stretch it had been at 23. That made it easier in the practical sense and harder in the psychological sense, because the greater the gap between what I was capable of doing and what I was choosing to continue doing, the more clearly I could see that I was choosing it, and the more I had to ask myself why. The answer, when I made myself look at it honestly, was that the rent was the most concrete thing I had. It was the one contribution I made to my family that was unambiguous. I could not make my mother warmer with me. I could not make Declan more interested in my life. I could not make Rosalind stop looking through me when her attention was elsewhere. But I could make the rent go away as a problem, and so I did, and somewhere in doing that I had confused solving a problem with being valued by the people who had the problem. They are not the same thing. I understood that by 2023. I continued the transfers anyway for another 9 months, because understanding a thing and being ready to stop doing it are two different thresholds. The lease on the apartment I found for myself was signed on February 19, 2024. It was a one-bedroom on the 4th floor of a building 12 minutes from my office, with south-facing windows and a kitchen small enough to feel manageable, and the monthly rent was $1,470. Gerald Osei, the property manager, walked me through the terms at 4:30 p.m. on a Tuesday with the professional thoroughness of someone who has explained lease agreements several thousand times and still explains them carefully each time. I signed on the line on page 7. He said welcome and shook my hand, and I sat in my car in the lot outside his office for a while before driving home, feeling something I did not have a word for yet. The voice note from my Uncle Bryn arrived on March 21st at 9:07 p.m. My Uncle Bryn is my father's brother, which makes him a complicated presence in a family whose main axis runs through my mother's side, but Bryn has maintained a relationship with my mother and with Declan and with Rosalind over the years that functions on the basis of shared opinions about me. He is not cruel. He is the kind of person who believes that delivering hard truths is a form of love, and who has arranged his life such that the hard truths he most often delivers concern other people's behavior rather than his own. The voice note was 4 minutes and 11 seconds long. I know because I checked the timestamp before I played it, and again after. He said that my mother was very upset. He said that this was not the time to be making decisions about distance. He said that family meant something, and that the way I was handling this, just announcing it and leaving, as he put it, showed a kind of selfishness that he had worried about in me for some time. He said, "You always think about yourself. You never cared about this family the way this family has cared for you." He said he hoped I would reconsider, and he said he loved me, which is how he ended the voice note, with love, after 4 minutes of it. I listened to the whole thing sitting at my kitchen table on March 21st at 9:18 p.m. I listened to it once, completely, without pausing it. Then I put my phone face down on the table and looked at the window for a while. The voice note was not the only message that week. My cousin Priya, Rosalind's daughter, a year older than me, who I had been close to as children and had drifted from without specific incident over the preceding years, sent a text on March 22nd at 10:44 a.m. It said, "Heard you're moving out. Mum is really upset. Just want to say, family is supposed to come first. I hope you know what you're doing to them." I read the text 3 times. Then I put my phone in my desk drawer and did not look at it for the rest of the day. What struck me about Priya's message and about Bryn's voice note and about Rosalind's call and about my mother's closed bedroom door, what struck me about all of it was the unanimity of the framing. In every version of events being offered to me that week, the story was the same. I was leaving, which was a thing I was doing to them. Nobody in that week's worth of messages asked where I was going. Nobody asked if I was excited. Nobody asked how I felt about having my own space for the first time, or what the apartment was like, or whether I needed help moving. The only questions, implicit or explicit, were about the family's experience of my departure, and those questions were not framed as questions. They were framed as verdicts. This is not a new observation. I had understood the shape of this dynamic for years. But there is a difference between understanding something intellectually and having it demonstrated to you with complete clarity in the space of 7 days by 5 separate people, and what that demonstration did. Arriving in the week I had finally done the thing I had been planning since January, was to remove the last ambiguity I had been holding on to. I had told myself, somewhere in the background logic of why I had not canceled the rent transfer yet, that perhaps someone would call and ask the right question. Perhaps my mother would sit with the news for a day, and then call me and say she was proud of me. Perhaps Declan would text something that acknowledged, even obliquely, what I had been carrying. I had not consciously articulated this hope, but I recognized it when it went away, on March 22nd at 10:44 a.m., reading my cousin Priya's text in my desk drawer before putting my phone away. No one was going to ask the right question. Not because they were cruel, but because no one knew there was a right question to ask. The picture they had of me did not include the rent. It included a daughter who was leaving, a niece who had always been a little difficult to read, a cousin who chose herself over the family. That was the picture. And you cannot correct a picture by waiting for someone to look at it differently. Something inside me finally hardened instead of bent. Not the hardening of anger, not sharp, not hot. The hardening of something that has been soft for too long and has finally reached the temperature at which softness becomes something else. I thought about the $1,850 transfer set for April 2nd. I thought about the 31 payments that had already gone out. I thought about Gerald Osei handing me a copy of my lease on February 19th and the feeling I had not yet had a word for, and I understood, sitting at that table on March 21st, that the word for it was mine. I had a home that was mine. I had signed it with my own name and my own income and my own decision. And I had also been sustaining, for 31 months, a home for people who, in the week I announced I was leaving it, could not find a single word that was not about what my leaving cost them. The decision did not feel large. It felt like the logical conclusion of a calculation I had been running for a long time without writing it down. I did not cancel the April transfer that night. I gave myself until the 29th, moving day, to be sure. I moved out on March 29th, 2024. I had hired a small moving service, 2 men named Paolo and Chris who arrived at 8 a.m. in a white van, and the process of moving my things from the room I had lived in for 19 years took 3 hours and 40 minutes. My mother was home for the first hour of it. She moved through the apartment in a deliberate way that was distinct from her ordinary movements, slower, more present in whatever room I was not in, and at 9:23 a.m. she said she needed to go run an errand, and she left, and she did not come back before Paolo and Chris finished loading the van at 11:37 a.m. Declan helped me carry 2 boxes to the van without being asked, which I noted and appreciated. He said, "You good?" I said yes. He said, "Text me the address." I said I would. That was the fullest conversation we had that day. I had not hired movers for sentiment. I hired them because I owned a drafting table. Heavy, a gift I had given myself at 24 when I started taking on independent clients, and I could not carry it alone. Paolo and Chris were efficient and professional and did not comment on the fact that my mother left midway through, though I noticed Paolo glance at the closed bedroom door once, and then look away with the deliberate tact of a man who has moved many people out of many complicated situations and has learned that the work goes better without commentary. The apartment I was leaving had been my home for 19 years. I had grown up inside it, had done my homework on the kitchen table, had spent my first 3 years of working adult life in the smaller of the 2 back bedrooms with the window that looked at the side wall of the adjacent building. I did not feel sentimental about it, which surprised me. I felt something more like the sensation of having completed a long task, the quiet physical exhaustion of a thing that is now done. At 12:14 p.m. I handed Declan the key I had carried for the apartment my entire adult life. He took it without ceremony and put it on the counter by the door. I drove away. In my rear-view mirror, the building looked exactly like itself. On March 31st, a Sunday, I sat at my new kitchen table with my laptop and opened the automatic payment settings for the transfer to the property management company. I looked at the upcoming transaction. April 2nd. $1,850. As scheduled. I canceled it. The confirmation email arrived at 11:09 p.m. I closed the laptop. I made a cup of tea. I stood at my south-facing window and looked at the city below me and felt something quiet and final that was not guilt and was not satisfaction, something closer to the feeling you get when you stop holding a door open against wind, and the wind stops being a problem, and there's just the room. The property management company's automated reminder notice went out on April 5th at 9 a.m. to the account email on the lease, my mother's email address, which she had provided when she first signed years ago. The notice stated that the April payment had not been received and that a late fee of $92.50 would be applied if payment was not received within 5 business days. My mother called me at 11:47 a.m. on April 5th. I answered. She said, "There's something wrong with the rent. Did you get a notice? I said I did not live at that address anymore. She was quiet. Then she said, the payment didn't go through. I said I had canceled the transfer. Another silence. Longer. Then, Isobel, what do you mean you canceled it? I said that I had been making the rent payment since September 2021, the full $1,850, not just the increase, and that when I moved out I stopped, and that going forward the rent payment would need to come from whoever was living there. She said, you were paying the whole rent. I said yes. She said, for how long? I said 31 months. The line was quiet for a long moment. Outside my window, a delivery truck was idling below on the street, engine running, and I could hear it clearly because my new apartment was quiet in a way the old one never quite was. Then my mother said very carefully, we didn't know. I said I know. She said, why didn't you tell us? I said I didn't think it would change anything. She said, that's not fair. And I understood what she meant by it, that it was not fair to make a contribution and then withdraw it without warning, and I also understood that the unfairness of it landed differently depending on where you were standing. We talked for 19 more minutes. It was not a resolution. It was not a fight. It was a conversation that had been accumulating for 31 months and had finally found its occasion. By April 10th, Declan had called twice. He said he was not angry, he just needed to understand what was happening because the landlord was asking about the payment. I said the same thing I had said to my mother. I was paying the rent, I stopped when I moved out, the payment now needs to come from the apartment. He said, okay. I hear you. He sounded more tired than angry, which was its own kind of answer. Rosalind called on April 12th at 2:38 p.m. Her tone was different from her initial call in March, less concerned, more directed. She said that what I was doing was cutting off the family out of spite, and that if I had a problem I should have said something instead of letting it build to this. I said I had not let it build. I had made a decision when I moved out, the same way anyone makes decisions about their own financial accounts when they change their living situation. She said, that's not how family works. I said that was probably something worth thinking about, and I said it gently, and I meant it that way. My Uncle Bryn called on April 14th. He had heard the full picture by then from my mother, from Rosalind, and his voice had shifted significantly from the voice note of March 21st. He said he had not realized. He said he thought I had always been comfortable and hadn't known the situation with the rent. I said I understood. He did not apologize directly, but he said twice that he should have asked more questions before sending that voice note. It was as close as Bryn comes to an apology, which I have learned over the years is different from a full one, but is not nothing. The April rent was paid late, on April 13th, after the $92.50 late fee had been applied. My mother covered it from her own account for the first time in 2.5 years. I know this because she told me on a call on April 15th, not as a complaint but as a quiet acknowledgement of what had been happening, what she had not fully known was happening. She said, I'm going to figure it out. I believed her. That is something I have always been able to say about my mother. When she says she will figure something out, she means it. The May payment went through on time. The conversation with my mother on April 5th had ended without resolution, which is how most of the important conversations in my family end, not in a fight, not in a reconciliation, but in a kind of suspension, both parties knowing more than they did before, and neither sure yet what to do with the knowing. I had said what I needed to say. She had heard it. The rest was hers to work with. What I did not expect was my mother calling again on April 8th, 3 days later, at 7:31 p.m., and saying something different than she had said before. She said she had been thinking. She said she owed me a conversation she should have started years ago, about money, about the rent, about all of it, and that she had not started it because she had not wanted to see it clearly, which was not fair to me, and she knew that. It was the most direct she had been with me about money in my life. I sat in my kitchen and listened, and did not rush it. She said she was going to look into whether she could increase her hours. She said Rosalind was going to start contributing to the household expenses. They had already had that conversation. She said Declan had applied for a second shift at the warehouse. She was not asking me to come back. She was not asking me to restart the transfer. She was telling me what she was doing, and the difference between those things, between asking and telling, was the first thing she had given me in a long time that felt, specifically, like she was trying. I said I was glad to hear it. I said I thought she was going to be all right. I meant both things. I have been in my apartment for 2 months now as I sit writing this. The south-facing windows let in a particular quality of morning light that I did not expect and have come to depend on. I make coffee earlier than I used to before the building wakes up, and sometimes I sit with it at the table by the window and do nothing for 15 or 20 minutes, which is something I could not do in the apartment I grew up in because there was always someone else's noise filling the space. I still speak to my mother. We are navigating something new between us. Something more honest, and more unsteady for being more honest, and probably more real for being both. Declan and I text. Rosalind and I are polite in the way of people who have reached a mutual understanding that directness is the only mode that will work going forward. My Uncle Bryn sends me a message sometimes that doesn't require anything from me, which is a different register than we have operated in before, and I am paying attention to it. The word they used about me, selfish, sits differently now than it did on March 21st when I was listening to Bryn's voice note with my phone in my hand at 9:18 p.m. I have thought about that word. I know what they meant by it. That I was putting my own needs ahead of the family's, that I was prioritizing my own comfort over their stability. And in the narrow sense of the word, the sense in which any self-determined act can be called selfish, they were right. I moved out because I needed to. I stopped the rent payment because it was mine to stop. But selfishness requires a self to care for. And for 31 months, the self I had done the most to care for was not mine. There is a financial planner I spoke with in February, a few weeks before I signed the lease, a woman named Adiz Nwosu at a small independent firm 2 blocks from my office. I had made the appointment at 3 p.m. on February 6th because I wanted an outside perspective on whether my plan was financially sound before I committed to it. A new lease at $1,470 a month, the cessation of the $1,850 transfer, my existing savings, my freelance income alongside the studio salary. She spent 45 minutes with me, and at the end of it she said, "The numbers work." She also said, unprompted, that she saw this kind of situation often. Clients who had been financially supporting family members informally and invisibly, and who had come to see her only once they had already decided to stop. She said the hardest part for most of them was not the money. I said I knew what she meant. She said, "Good. Then you're already past the worst of it." I thought about that on the morning I canceled the transfer. I thought about it again in the days after as the phone calls came in, and I answered them, and had the conversations that needed to be had. Adiz Nwosu was right. The worst of it was the internal part. The external part, the missed payment, the late fee, the explanations, was just logistics. And I have always been good at logistics. Family is not the same thing as the account it runs on. And when you confuse the two for long enough, the day you stop paying stops feeling like abandonment and starts feeling, quietly, simply, like the first month in a very long time that belongs entirely to you. One thing worth knowing if you are in a situation like the one I was in, under most residential lease agreements in the United States, if your name is the account holder or the guarantor on a lease, even informally, even just as the consistent payment source, you have the right to stop payment at any time. You do not owe prior notice to the landlord if you are not the named tenant on the lease. You do not owe prior notice to the family. The account is yours. The payment is yours. The decision is yours. This does not mean there will not be consequences for others, there will be. But the legal fact is simple. What comes out of your account is yours to control. If you were in Isobel's place, if your family spent the week you moved out calling you selfish, cold, and ungrateful, not knowing you had been covering their rent for 31 months, would you have canceled that first missed payment the way she did, quietly, and let the April 5th notice be their education? Or would you have told them everything before you moved out, so the discovery happened on your terms instead of the landlord's?